Next year, Freemasons around the globe will celebrate the 300th anniversary of the first date, June 24, 1717, when, or about that date, the first organized Masonic government that we know today as Grand Lodges was formed. 42 years later, on November 28, 1759, the Masters and Wardens of 6 lodges, meeting in some of the regiment in General James Wolfe's army at Quebec, after having taken the city and New France for England, assembled and formed themselves into a Grand Lodge and appointed one of their number of what they called the greatest skill and merit to accept the title of Grand Master from the authority of those lodges until such time as a proper sanction could be obtained from the Grand Master of England. Those were their words. This institution would establish English Freemasonry in the future Canadas, but it disappeared by the next date, March 7, 1792, when patents for William Jarvis and the Duke of Kent were issued for the Ancients Grand Lodges, for Jarvis in Upper Canada and for the Duke of Kent in Lower Canada. Lieutenant John Price Gannett of the 47th Foot was chosen as Grand Master, Captain Thomas Augustus Spann of the 28th Foot as Deputy Grand Master, and these ranks and titles of offices are quite important. Private Edward Huntingford of Spann's company in the 28th Foot as Senior Grand Warden, and a Sergeant Paxton of the 47th Foot of Junior Grand Warden. These are interesting results because at the time great empires were ruled by a monarch, by divine right, and an aristocracy by inheritance. Nationwide democratic elections were many years off. Military organizations had institutionalized command and control through a fixed and rigid rank structure. This new British territory, which is this slide, ruled from Quebec City, was defined under British law as stretching west of the city of Quebec along the north shores of the St. Lawrence and the Great Lakes to the end of habitation, and east of the city, excluding Labrador and the Gulf Islands, it spread along the 45th parallel, and it added 75,000 new citizens under the King of Britain. Gunner Thomas Dunkerley, if you were at Sankey last year, was a member of the Royal Navy. He was a gunner. He fought at Quebec. He carried the report and letters to the Grand Lodge in London requesting approval of the action to form the Grand Lodge. He was an illegitimate son of George II, but importantly for us, he was a Mason. In London, he made his presentation to his friends, and they approached Grand Lodge, and the rest was that the Grand Master approved the formation of the body, but not the election of that first Grand Master. So the future Masonic government over the future Ontario was a Moderns one, and was in place for 32 years before William Jarvis was appointed as Ancients Provincial Grand Master and settled at, not Newark, that's today's expression, at New Ark, as identified by John Graves Simcoe as being an area of relative stability after the American Revolution. Number 4, please. 5 of the 6 lodges which formed this Grand Lodge were Irish. Done them here just to make it a little easier. Lodge 192, Irish in the 47th Foot, 218 in the 48th Foot, 245 in the 15th Foot, and for the time and following the tradition, a lodge under dispensation in the 43rd Foot, where it held its dispensation from a lodge in another regiment. That's the way you formed lodges in most periods at that early stage, and especially in the military. There was a lodge under dispensation in the artillery at Quebec from 195 and the 42nd Foot, and interestingly, at a time when the world of Masons was at war, Ancients and Moderns, having split in 1751 officially, Louisbourg Lodge number 1 was working under a warrant issued by the Provincial Grand Lodge of Massachusetts, which was a Moderns institution that dates from 1758. 5 Irish and 1 Moderns is not surprising. It's not a terribly surprising ratio. Of 500 ambulatory and stationary warrants issued to hold lodges and military units, 220 were issued by the Irish Grand Lodge, 34 by Scotland, 74 by the Moderns or Premier Grand Lodge of England, 142 by the Ancients, and 29 by United Grand Lodge itself. Next slide, please, 5. The first known military lodge anywhere in the world was Irish, authorized as number 11 on November 7, 1732, to be held in the 1st Regiment of Foot, the 1st Battalion of the 1st Regiment of Foot. People used words differently, and it's described slightly differently. It's described as the 1st Battalion Royal. This was the Royal Regiment. It was the 1st Regiment of Foot. The number 11, I speculate, I won't go into it here, but very quickly was just when you're in the military and you write 1st Battalion, 1st Regiment, 1/1, why not ask for a warrant number 11? These were small lodges by the day and by today's standards. They met infrequently. Regiments were often spread out, and men were in penny packets all over the place. Lodge numbers could not really be met. The origin of a word, occasional lodges, dates from about this time. So 5 guys get together, they're all Masons, it doesn't matter what kind. They decide to have, in their words, a Masonic meeting. Nothing irregular about that. Grand Lodges absolved military lodges from any need to provide annual returns. Given the peripatetic existence in war zones and the unreliability of communications. That's why we don't have a great deal of information. In its 30 years of existence, 3 decades, this Grand Lodge lived and encouraged Masonic principles of brotherly love, relief, and truth, and applied them to a large area which had only shortly ceased being the enemy. In that first winter of 1759-60, the written record that still exists today shows that everybody, victors and vanquished, English, French, Catholics, non-Catholics, Europeans, Aboriginals, they shared their possessions, especially food and living facilities, as this was the severest winter on record. Thus, I would say for us here, the first of many great charity works began at that particular time in that winter. This Grand Lodge helped strengthen the relations with Indigenous people, which was started with the creation in 1755 of an Indian department. These were our allies fighting against first the French, then the Americans, holding the border in the War of 1812. While we may have, shortly after that, forgotten their importance to us, this seems to be returning today. This Grand Lodge provided Masonic authority to all and every lodges in the area shown in that earlier slide that now constituted the colony of Canada. It extended as far west as Detroit and Michilimackinac. It wasn't until the influx of merchants, traders, and all kinds of professional men, retiring military personnel, and Europeans and British peoples in search of new lands where they could settle and raise families, only then did that Grand Lodge, now housed in the Citadel at Quebec, start to focus on civilian lodges. During its existence, this 3 decades, it extended its authority over 63 lodges, including Ancients lodges, which were technically in disharmony with moderns, but he brought them together. 2 of those Ancients lodges were established in the military at Quebec, and they survive today embodied in Albion Lodge number 2 and St. John's Lodge number 3, which are still working in Quebec. Of the 63 lodges, 40 were military. 3 were in Ontario. I'll get back to them in a minute. 23 were civilian. 9 were in Ontario. 12 were in Quebec. I'll get back to those in a moment. In terms of lodges created and closed, if we wanted to think about the statistics on the growth of the Grand Lodge, it would expand after the French had been defeated, and it would contract throughout the American Revolution, and it would expand again as the Loyalists came up to Canada. This Grand Lodge was ruled by 9 Grand Masters, 6 of whom we know very little about. but they did leave a mark on Ontario, 3 of which we do know more about, and they very definitely left a mark on Ontario. I want to mention the first, Lieutenant Thomas Price Cadet. His election was not recognized by the Grand Master, but the Grand Master recognized the formation of a provincial Grand Lodge, which is what it said in the piece of paper, which allowed the institution to exist whether a Grand Master was present or absent. We talked about that this morning in terms of managing through teams. When the boss is away, the system has to keep working, and it did. What's important about Gannett is he issued the warrant for a merchant's lodge at Quebec. And while it had a short life, 1758 to about 1832, it had 2 distinct key actions in history. It was one of 3 lodges which in 1791 asked the Duke of Kent to become the Ancients Provincial Grand Master of Canada. Fortunately, Britain had already decided the year before to divide the country up, and that's why we have Jarvis and we have the Duke of Kent as 2 distinct Grand Masters instead of just 1. But that was an important action to be taken by the lodge. The other was its recognition, if you could do the next slide, please. It was recognizing one of its own members, Major John Norton, the leader of the Five Nations Confederacy, a member of the lodge, and it presented him with a medal in recognition of his services against invading Americans in the War of 1812. I know you can't read it very well. You can't even read it when it's on paper, but it says, "To Brother Norton, Captain and Leader of the Five Nations, from Lodge number 4040 at Quebec, AYM, meaning Ancient York Masons. As a token of remembrance, 19th of March, AL, Anno Lucius, 5814, 5814. The second Grand Master was Colonel Simon Fraser of the 78th Foot, a member of Lodge 277 Moderns in the 78th Foot, which had been formed in 1759. He was elected Grand Master in 1760 and was installed by Thomas Dunkerley before Dunkerley finally left and returned to London. The Colonel was deputed as Provincial Grand Master for 1761-62 by Lord Aberdour, the Moderns Grand Master, but he had left Canada in the summer of 1760 and he never returned. A probable 5 warrants. We have to say probable because it's not clear whether it's 5 or 4 actually being issued from the remaining records. But they were issued in spite of his absence. His deputy, Captain Thomas Augustus Spann, became the next Grand Master in 1760. But his appointment was not accepted by the Grand Master, and no warrants for in his term were ever issued. The fourth was Lieutenant Milburn West of the 47th Foot, who, while he was accepted by the Grand Master in England, by the time that authority came through, he'd already left and returned to England, but no warrants were issued. Lieutenant Thomas Turner of the 47th Foot, interestingly, was an Ancients Mason hailing from the lodge at the King's Arms Tavern in Halifax. Number 3 local, number 67 Ancients. Halifax, Canada, Nova Scotia, as opposed to Halifax in Yorkshire. We have no documents on his career, nor on the last, Joseph Walker, who was believed to be a member of Merchants Lodge, but we can't confirm that. The 3 Grand Masters of interest to us, very importantly, Brother the Honorable John Collins. He's well remembered as a surveyor. He became Surveyor General, surveyed the boundary between Canada and the state of New York by using a superior piece of equipment to identify the 45th parallel, which was accepted by both governments. After the American Revolution, he was assigned to Kingston, where he surveyed and laid out townships like Kingston, Ernestown, Fredericksburg, Adolphustown. And in one of those early surveys of the complete area was used for the settlement of Loyalists as they moved across the river. He was a member of Merchants Lodge. Collins also, on the next slide, 7, please. Collins also authorized the formation of Officers' Lodge in the 8th or King's Regiment of Foot. There's been a lot of debate. Grand Archivist and I chortle about some of these things, but in a number of books, the regiment is referred to as the King's Own. It's actually the King's. This is a reproduction of a smoke seal on one of their documents. What's important about this lodge in the 8th King's Regiment, this is when the King's was at Niagara-on-the-Lake, and both this regiment and the regimental lodge, which was number 156, a Moderns Lodge, which had been the first Moderns Lodge in the military. These had links with Colonel John Butler, Colonel John Graves Simcoe, and other Masons of the day to keep the system going and to bolster it. In fact, Collins was the man who recognized and accepted St. John's Lodge of Friendship at Niagara, where did Dan go, as having existed since before 1780, making it today the oldest lodge, but not the oldest lodge of a time in the Grand Lodge of Canada in the province of Ontario. This lodge, Lodge of Friendship, is now known as Niagara No. 2, established before 1780, and on June 24 this year, it will be celebrating the 200th anniversary of its Masonic Hall building. Collins is also important because he authorized Union Lodge at Detroit, which is the ancestor of today's Zion Lodge. He also authorized St. Paul's Lodge in Montreal. If you're from Ottawa or Eastern Ontario, the eastern townships of Ontario, the western townships of Quebec, certainly Ontario, you'd be interested because if you wish, in the Royal Arch, if you wish to see an English Mark Master Mason degree, this lodge, St. Paul's, still exists as number 374 England. It still works under that English authority within Quebec, which is under the jurisdiction of the Grand Lodge of Quebec. And it works and has a Mark Master Mason Lodge attached to the lodge warrant. We have a second lodge of this type, and only these two in Canada operating under foreign jurisdiction, which in this case is England, Royal Standard 398 in Halifax. The 8th Grand Master was Colonel Christopher Carleton, the nephew of Sir Guy Carleton, who was Lord Dorchester. Christopher issued 2 warrants in his time which are of importance to us. One was New Oswegatchie Lodge at Ogdensburg, New York, which was under an ancient Provincial Grand Lodge of New York warrant, which removed to Elizabethtown and became part of Brockville, which was part of Brockville, I should say, and which carried on until it expired. But it was a parent of Hiram Lodge, which today we know as Sussex No. 5. The last Grand Master, very close to now being able to let somebody else speak for a few moments, but our last Grand Master of this Provincial Grand Lodge was Sir John Johnson, Baronet. Well known for his loyalist activities during the French and Indian Wars, the Revolution. He was initiated into Royal Lodge in London. He was a member of St. Patrick's Lodge in Jamestown, New York. He was Provincial Grand Master of New York until 1767, from 1767 until the end of the Revolution, when he removed to Montreal and became a de facto Provincial Grand Master of Quebec. 5 warrants were issued by him, including Union Lodge at Cornwall, which while it lived for but a short time, 1790 to 1803, helped begin Freemasonry in that southeastern corner of our province. He authorized the lodge between the 2 lakes, 1792. It's also known as Rawdon Lodge. For those of you from Toronto, might remember that the origin of Royal Arch working in New York is believed to go back to 1800 and is reflected in the name of this lodge when it took a warrant as St. John's Royal Arch Lodge, registered in 1801 as number 16 Upper Canada Ancients. This was a parent of King Solomon's Chapter, Scarborough, in 1819 and St. George's Lodge in 1825. No accounting of our first Provincial Grand Lodge would be justifiable without mentioning the Provincial Grand Secretary, James Thompson of the 78th Fraser's Highlanders. He fought at Louisbourg and Quebec with deadly effect. His sword, you said a skein do. I thought it was his dirk, but anyway, it's his knife. It's his sock knife. Is on display at the Canadian War. Well, the sword, his claymore, is on display at the Canadian War Museum. His knife is not available on display, but it's at the Canadian War Museum. In the post-war period, he became head of military engineering over the entire colony. In 1828, as Deputy Grand Master of Quebec and Three Rivers, and the oldest living survivor of the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, he participated in the laying of the cornerstone of the Wolfe and Montcalm Monument at the Chateau Saint Louis in Quebec. And it is his ledger book that has recorded much of the Masonic events of 1759 and afterwards. We owe much, whether we like one thing or another, whether we think Jarvis was the first or the second, doesn't really matter. What is important is this was simply a step in the process of the evolution of Freemasonry in Upper Canada, which became Ontario, and helped spread the fraternity in spite of the challenging conditions of the day, and simply proves that the goodness of Masonry can indeed survive over the years and in a lot of adverse conditions. Thank you.